Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another World of Warcraft tier list. This time, we will be doing all of the Mythic Plus affixes. Now, you will see here, you'll see three distinct icons missing, and they are Incorporeal, Afflicted, and Entangling. Well, that's because nobody has done a tier list, including Incorporeal and Entangling. Well, someone has. Tettles did a tier list. Tettles made this tier list for all Mythic Plus affixes. Here's the problem. He hasn't done none of the seasonal affixes are included on this list. And I feel like the seasonals are important to rank. So, I will be using this tier list for Afflicted, Incorporeal, and Entangling, and I will be using this one for every other affix, as it has all of the removed ones as well, and the seasonals, every seasonal. Almost every seasonal. This one doesn't seem to include... unless I'm missing it. Is this one Torment? Is this one Shrouded? Might be Shrouded. I don't know. I'll find out. Okay, so we'll start with removed ones. Overflowing. Hard D. Overflowing. Overflowing was an affix in Season 1 of Legion only. Overflowing was an affix in Season 1 of Legion only, where all overhealing done to a player gave them a healing absorb shield. And obviously that healing absorb shield could be really detrimental to making sure that your party members, and especially your tank, did not die. Overflowing, I guess, wasn't very well liked. I didn't really have too much interaction with Overflowing myself, but it was removed directly after Season 1 of Legion. Like, basically, as soon as Nighthold launched, Overflowing was gone. So, I mean, conceptually, it's kind of cool. But in practice, I reckon it's probably very, very problematic. So, I mean, good riddance, I guess. I would hate to, turbo crit heal when people are at like 2/3 HP and everybody get like a double their life healing absorb. That'd be terrible. The next one we're going to look at is Necrotic. I think Necrotic in its final iteration wasn't all that bad, having a really low duration. I think the biggest problem with Necrotic, I think the two biggest problems with Necrotic were that when Necrotic was hugely a problem, excuse me, when Necrotic was hugely a problem, Blizzard had a bit of a fetish for lieutenant mobs that can't be slowed or otherwise CC'd. So you'd have to have some type of speed or assistance to get away from mobs that could continue to attack you and apply stacks of Necrotic. The second biggest issue with Necrotic was that there was a week in Shadowlands Season 2 that saw the probably one of the lowest Mythic Plus participations of nearly every week since the system's inception, and it was a Necrotic Sanguine week. Because with Sanguine, you want to slow mobs so they can't reach your tank. But with Sanguine, you don't want to slow mobs so they're not healing. And I believe it was also a fortified week. So powered up mobs plus Necrotic where you want them to not touch your tank, plus Sanguine where you can't slow them to help not touch your tank, was just a really, really bad week. Easily one of the lowest participations I've seen in any Mythic Plus week since Legion launched. The next the next affix we're going to look at is Grievous. I think Grievous's final iteration in Season 1 wasn't all that bad. A stack of the bleed being removed whenever you directly healed a player was pretty good, as opposed to its BFA version where when you heal a player, they just retain the bleeds, so you need to just tunnel vision, single target, heavy healing into them to get rid of the debuff. I feel like that's a lot better than it was. I feel like its final iteration was a lot better than it was. That being said, I'm not exactly sad to see it go as somebody who frequently plays a healer in Mythic Plus on my own. It wasn't a terrible affix by the end of its lifespan, but it certainly wasn't a great one for most of it. Which leads us to Explosive. Explosive was just awful. Explosive was terrible. As Mythic Plus and as the game has gone on, I have gained more and more skill as a player. And one of my higher skill developing seasons was Season 1 of Dragonflight. And as a player still developing my skill to be a more skilled player in Season 1 of Dragonflight, I played a Mistweaver Monk. That was my main. Here's the thing as a Mistweaver Monk. I didn't want to hit explosives. I wanted to hit mobs, because Teachings of the Monastery. I wanted to hit mobs, not explosives. But the general consensus, due to high-level play, which understandably so, but the general consensus was, explosive is the healer's job. But the healer didn't want to do it either, in my experience, because if I'm having to tab target to these things or manually click them to hit them, I'm doing less healing than I could and should be doing because I'm not Rising Sun kicking and Blackout kicking into actual enemies. I'm just hitting an orb that doesn't cleave onto anything and it's dying in a single global. Nobody wanted to do explosive. No, not a single person wanted to do explosive. Not even the healer. In any context. Explosive just became such a punishing, problematic affix that at the end of Season 1, explosive went bye-bye, and I think the player base as a whole is happier for it. The next removed affix was Inspiring. And now I know a lot of the removed affixes are in C tier, but I mean they were removed for a reason, right? Like they're C or below because they sucked. Now Inspiring, this might be the wrong, I think this is the right icon for it, but I digress. Inspiring was an affix. Inspiring was an affix that one mob buffed the mobs around it to be immune to crowd control, while the inspired mob was within a certain distance of them. And that was slows, snares, stuns. It was just about everything, including interrupts, I believe. And this mechanic was seen in Beguiling Season, Season 3 of BFA, with the Enchanted Emissary. I think it was the Enchanted Emissary. Apparently going into Shadowlands, since that was the least disliked emissary, they made an affix based around it. And the general consensus ended up becoming, if the inspired mob is CCable, CC it, kite everything else out, nuke them down, then kill the CC mob. Or then kill the Inspire mob, which, you know, isn't a terrible strategy, but, you know, adds some unnecessary time. It didn't really do anything other than that. Like, it was just CC mob, kite out, that's it. Next up is Teaming. I'm going to put Teaming as a B. Now, a lot of people hate Teaming, in my experience. I've talked to a number of people about, like, Mythic Plus and affixes, and a lot of them hated Teaming. But I think Teaming was really funny. I think it messing with the dungeon count was a little jank and wasn't as fun, but I think Teaming was pretty cool in that as long as the mob or mobs added to packs weren't super problematic ones, Teaming's only issue was having to rethink how you did the dungeon. in order to get appropriate count, which in Legion was a non-issue because with Legion, dungeons gave so much count that, like, you were finished with percent about halfway through. They were just hold W to win, with the exception of some non-linearity, like in Ayojara. But I think teaming wasn't really all that bad. I think it gets unnecessarily complained about because extra mobs, as long as they weren't turbo problem mobs, weren't really all that bad a thing. It was just, it messed with your count in the dungeon for percent, and that was kind of the only issue with it. The next removed affix. I love this affix. And I'm probably gonna get a good bit of heat. I'm probably gonna get a good bit of heat. I'm probably gonna get a good bit of heat for what was the name of this affix? Shit. Let me look. Skittish, that's the name of it. I think Skittish was a really, really funny affix just because it wasn't like back in the day, which I think they were trying to emulate with Skittish, where it was like you have to let your tanks generate like a certain amount of threat and you have to just kind of like dance around that. It was just straight up, your tanks generate only like 10% of the threat they normally would from like all sources that they generate threat. So doing nearly anything as any other player just automatically took all of the threat off of you, and just I had a lot of fun laughing about Skittish and the just dumb, super scuffed shenanigans that happened with Skittish in Season 1. Or in Mythic Plus while it was in the game, because I think it lasted through BFA. I think finding Beast Mastery Hunter, I think finding Hunters and Rogues for misdirect and tricks of the trade to kind of play around Skittish was also really cool, because there is a lot of utility in classes that just kind of like doesn't get used too much. So kind of incentivizing them to use those abilities for anything other than them being juiced and the tank not, to help the tank have threat, I think was really good. The last to be removed was Quaking, which, with the exception of Season 1 of Shadowlands and Seasons 1 through 3 of BFA, I did not have many or any issues with Quaking. Now, I think the reason that Quaking gets shit on a lot by players is because Quaking every few seconds, for those that don't know, every 20 seconds there was a chance Quaking would happen. When Quaking happened, it happened to all players. You had about 4 seconds to not be within anybody else's circle, or it would deal damage to all players inside as of its final iteration, which happened Season 4 of Dragonflight. And if you were casting a spell, it would silence you in that spell school for 3 seconds. As of its iteration in BFA Season 4, it wasn't all that bad a dungeon. It was actually, or it wasn't that bad an affix. It was a pretty good affix, in my opinion. It wasn't too oppressive. It didn't damage you unless you were hugging other players, and not a whole lot of dungeons really like called for that to happen. And then we got Season 1 of Dragonflight. Season 1 of Dragonflight implemented the Thundering affix, which I'm going to go ahead and spit right in the F tier. We will explain Thundering. Now, Thundering incentivized stacking with other players, and could happen to overlap with Quaking, which, you know, required to not take damage, separating from other players. in addition to the dungeons we had mostly being a little more on the narrow side in Season 1 and mechanically incentivizing a lot more grouping close together as opposed to just like being able to spread out wherever the fuck you want it to be. So the combination of those dungeons themselves as well as Thundering combined with Quaking all together just made Quaking a really, really fucked up affix. And it wasn't very... It wasn't a very fun affix in Season 1, but I think Season 2 and even Season 3 of Dragonflight, and honestly, even Season 4, Quaking would not have been anywhere near as oppressive as it was in Dragonflight Season 1. Quaking didn't have to go, I'm sorry to see it go. It was a pretty okay affix. Maybe not A tier, maybe I'll move it down to B, but it wasn't as bad as people say that it was. So, I guess starting with seasonals, let's go with Thundering. Every 50 seconds, I think it was, maybe a minute 10, all players would be marked with a debuff. It would either be positive or a negative charge. You would get like I think a 15% increased damage done for like 12 seconds, and if you didn't connect with another player who had the opposite marker, you would be stunned and take huge damage for like 6 seconds. And that's why it paired really badly with Quaking, because, like I said before, Thundering required you to run through other people to not get stunned and take huge damage, and Quaking doesn't want you to stack with other people. So, Quaking plus Thundering ended up being like super bad, but Thundering itself was really bad. I think Dratnos ran some numbers on Thundering. If you maximized the buff to its like absolute turbo maximum length and benefit, I think the damage buff from Thundering did not outweigh one of Thundering's other properties, and that is that every enemy unit inside the dungeon, bosses and trash alike, all had plus 5% increased health. And that's, I believe, multiplicative with every other scaling because of key level, fortified, and tyrannical. Thundering was just a fucking mess of an affix, and I did some testing on the beta for Dragonflight where Thundering was even worse. So we got the better version on live of a bad affix that was still just horrible from start to finish. Definitely glad that's gone. If they ever choose to do like seasonals and rotate seasonals that existed again, Thundering's just going to be a horrible week. We'll do Spiteful next. C tier. I think Spiteful is kinda I think Spiteful doing huge melee damage just because they can is... I think Spiteful is alright-ish as an affix, to be fair. I think the biggest problem is that rogues and feral druids just get hard pissed on Spiteful week, because for the most part, rogues and feral druids want to enter stealth before, they start combat. And if your tank is any good, they're moving on while Spitefuls are alive and pulling more trash. So with that being the case, you're going with them to fight more trash, but because you're in combat with the Spitefuls, you can't enter stealth, which just really hard screws a lot of your damage. Other than that, I think they just lose HP at too slow a rate. I think they should lose more HP at a faster rate. And for the love of God, for the rogues and the feral druids, stop putting them in combat. Even if they're... Only if you're the target should you be put in combat. If you're not targeted by a Spiteful, you shouldn't be in combat with them. That's my take on it. We'll do Tyrannical and Fortified, since they're the two common affixes since Inception. Tyrannical, I'm going to put in D tier, and here's why. Some boss ads in Mythic Plus scale with Tyrannical. Some others scale with fortified, or so I've heard. Universally, though, tyrannical turns some dungeon bosses into huge slogs for no reason, or just straight up makes the tuning on some bosses in some dungeons just be really, really bad. If you were here for my Dragonflight, if you watched or were here for my Dragonflight Mythic Plus dungeon tier list, a really, really good example is Morazan's Rise, Dawn of the Infinites. The boss tuning in there is not terrible for the most part. I mean, you could make an argument for Deos, to be honest, but there is just nothing acceptable or forgivable about the tuning on Time Lost Battlefield for Tyrannical. There just isn't. I think it's indefensibly bad. And there have been many a dungeon and many a bosses in Mythic Plus's lifespan to share that same thing with Tyrannical. So I think Tyrannical is just a D tier affix. For the love of God, just fucking delete Tyrannical. Blizzard, please. And I don't want any flame in the comments about how I'm bad because Tyrannical isn't all that bad. Literally nobody among the community really likes Tyrannical. There is so few people who like Tyrannical. There are more people who don't mind Tyrannical compared to the people who actually like it. And the vocal majority really just hate Tyrannical. Please just rework or delete Tyrannical, Blizzard. On the other side of the coin, we have Fortified. I'm going to put Fortified in B tier, and here's why I'm going to put Fortified in B tier. Fortified in B tier means that as an AoE class, such as a Survival Hunter or Havoc Demon Hunter, classes that can do absurd amounts of AoE and can do more absurd amounts of AoE the longer things live in a trash pack. Fortified means things live longer. Things live longer, more AoE dam. More AoE dam, more fun for AoE pad classes. It's a really lame reasoning, but that's just kind of what it is. I think the biggest pain point for Fortified is that some mobs, namely mini-boss mobs or some boss ads, just have way more health than they fucking should, to be completely honest. Or some just do absurd amounts of damage. You ever been hit by like a 2-stack Arcane Blitz in Black Recold on like a 22 Tyrannical? It like fucking one-shots you for no reason. Other than that, I don't think Fortified is all that terrible an affix. Speaking of terrible affixes, we have the Gahoonies Infested Mythic Plus Season 1 Battle for Azeroth. So Mythic Plus Season 1 Battle for Azeroth had some mobs throughout the dungeon that would be infested by Gahoon. They would have a unique texture on their model, where any mobs near them would be healed for a percentage of their HP every, I think, 1 or 2 seconds. And when the infested mob died, it would spawn 2 little spawns of Gahoon, 2 little wormies. It was originally 4, but they nerfed it to 2. These wormies would seek out a target anywhere in the dungeon and run towards that target. If they caught the target, if the target wasn't in combat, it was now in combat with you, as was its whole pack. But if the spawn of Gahoon reached the target, the new target would become infested. And it just had the capacity to snowball horrifically out of control. If I remember right, and I might be remembering it wrong, but if I remember right, 2 infested mobs in combat with you could heal each other. So without hard CCing one of the infested and kiting the other one out and fighting it that way, I think fighting 2 or more infested in a pack together was just effectively not possible because they were unkillable with each other in party. I could be remembering it wrong, but even still, just because of how it was, infested isn't a very good affix. But it was a lot better than beguiling. So Beguiling was Season 3 of Battle for Azeroth's seasonal affix. There were 3 types of emissaries that would spawn in a dungeon, either Emissary of the Tides, Enchanted Emissary or Void Emissary that all did distinct things. I think like the Void Emissary had True Sight, the Enchanted Emissary had a big ol' shield that reflected damage back onto casters to all targets inside, but got knockbacked whenever it was damaged. Emissary of the Tides was the blueprint for the Inspiring Affix. It wasn't Enchanted, it was Emissary of the Tides. And every week on a rotation would change which dungeons had more of which emissary. And just none of the emissaries were very fun. The most tolerable emissary ended up becoming an affix later in Emissary of the Tides, becoming inspired. Other than that, it wasn't exactly the best affix that Blizzard has ever created. It was better than... I might argue that Beguiling was better than Thundering. Thundering was really that bad, but I mean, I think Beguiling just was not all that great. While we're on the topic, let's do Reaping. I think Reaping was a phenomenal affix. I might actually move it up to A tier. So whenever non-boss enemies died in an instance, maybe even boss enemies, I don't remember which, it would leave behind this soul. And every 20% trash count, Bwansamdi would call Rise Fallen Ones. And every spook that had been spawned by killing trash up to that point, and if you wiped through the remainder of the dungeon that you hadn't killed from the previous Reaping waves, would run through the dungeon to find you. And they all had unique abilities that they would do. They all had unique things that they would do. There were 3 different kinds. But it was really just LOS them and just have a huge AoE fuckfest every 20% of trash count. And I think that was genuinely just one of the funniest and coolest parts of Reaping. Reaping's other unique point is that it started the whole end of dungeon, or it started the whole depletion bonus gimmick, which we did not see in Season 1, but which we didn't see in Season 1, we didn't see in Season 3, but it did start from Season 4 to present, where if you deplete the timer, you can talk to an NPC in the dungeon that will reset lust for you, or that will reset your lust debuff, not your bloodlust or heroism cooldowns, but your bloodlust debuff, heal you back to full HP and I think mana, and for Bwansamdi specifically would give you a buff. It was 20% increased damage and healing, I believe it was, for Bwansamdi. I think Prideful Encrypted, I believe, also did something extra in addition to being able to reset Lust. But Bwansamdi, with Season 2's Reaping, was the start of it. Next up, we have Bolstering, D tier. Bolstering on its own isn't a very... When you have smaller trash packs and you're not pulling massively, or you can relatively comfortably kill all of them around the same time frame, bolstering isn't that oppressive. But when you put it in a dungeon like Throne of the Tides, in some cases, or the Everbloom as a really recent example, bolstering is just kinda unforgivable. Because things that should not trigger it, and it becomes a huge problem for no reason. Bolstering has consistently been a talked about semi-problem affix since its inception in Legion, and maybe BFA. But here we are, with bolstering being a problem in Season 3. It'll probably be a problem in Season 4 too. So bolstering can suck it in the D tier. Storming. Storming is a C tier. I think Storming's biggest issues as an affix are that it... I think Storming's biggest issues as an affix are that it... I think Storming's biggest issue as an affix is that as a caster, it kind of sucks to be hit by one. And if very specific positioning is required in some capacity, Storming very well has the possibility to kind of scuff that. It's not exactly the most oppressive thing. It's just a little bit annoying. It doesn't do like too big a damage. It's nothing really. It's nothing to write home about. So I'm gonna put it in the C tier as just kind of, You don't hate to see Storming. It's just a little annoying. Sanguine. I think Sanguine's an okay affix. I think its current iteration is maybe a bit weaker than its previous one, but I think Sanguine isn't exactly a terrible affix. It has the capacity to heal mobs and damage you, but it doesn't last all that long. It doesn't last all that long. And it's not as oppressive as it used to be, but I mean, like, in a dungeon like Waycrest Manor or Grimrail Depot, it can be a little tedious to deal with, but it's, in more wide-open dungeons, such as No Coup Defensive and, like, Galakron's Fall, it's really not an oppressive affix at all. Like, just pre-kite before something dies, and the affix basically doesn't exist. Speaking of affixes that don't exist, Volcanic. Volcanic can be summed up in a few words. In Melee, this affix doesn't exist. If mobs aren't running all over the place, and you are a ranged DPS or a healer, just stack in Melee, and Volcanic literally never happens. Other than that, its damage isn't too bad, but it knocks you up in the air as of S1 Shadowlands. But it still isn't really all that problematic or oppressive an affix. Or, yeah, not impressive, oppressive, both adjectives fit. Volcanic is, C tier it goes. Bursting. I'm going to put Bursting in B. I think Bursting in B is okay. I like that it is dispellable. I like that its damage scales with key level. I like that it's in a position where it can actually be handled by healers instead of, you know, you have to, mass dispel or it's a group wipe. You can actually handle it as long as stacks don't get too high. And then Mistweaver and Priest as a whole get some benefit with Revival and Mass Dispel on Bursting weeks. Bursting isn't the oppressive problem it was in like Season 1 and 2 of BFA. Its newest iteration, its present iteration as of I don't remember how long ago, is one of the better affixes. I think one of its newest fixes is that Bursting doesn't interrupt mounting up anymore, and that's really that's a big buff to bolstering, honestly, because like if stacks aren't too high, you don't have to worry about running manually or just sitting there. You can mount up and you can take the fuck off. You're good to go. It's an enjoyable and engaging affix that isn't terribly oppressive. Bursting is pretty good. B tier it is. Raging is its newest iteration as of Season 2 of Dragonflight is really boring because it makes mobs immune to CC. And that's it. They don't have the health gain anymore, I don't think. They don't have the damage gain anymore, I don't think. It's a really boring affix that is actually kind of trivialized if you have an Evoker that's spec'd into Overawe and, that's spec'd into Overawe. Because you can just mass dispel an entire cone of raging off of shit, and they can be CC'd again. It's not a really engaging... The affix basically doesn't exist until low HP values on mobs, where you might want to or need to CC for kiting, or to move on to the next pack. And in that case, it's only just annoying. It's not oppressive. Prideful. I played Unholy Death Knight when Prideful was relevant, so I never really got to enjoy Prideful, because with the people I played with at the time, I had to blow my cooldowns to kill the Prideful mob, you know, to actually contribute to its death. But if I saved cooldowns, we wiped constantly. If I didn't save cooldowns, I didn't have anything to enjoy the Prideful buff with. In addition to, I think the scaling damage, I think the increasing tick damage on Prideful just existing, big problematic, no bueno, yuck. Next we have Tormented. I thought Tormented was really cool. I really did. I thought Tormented was super rad. Not a lot of people agreed with me, understandably, but I thought Tormented was really, really cool. Basically 4 mini-bosses that rotate their position every week between where the other mini-bosses are located, and each of them drops an anima cell that, based on your class and role, you will have one of 3 options. Obviously a Torghast-themed affix. And I mean, like, the options were really, like, cookie cutter and stuff like that, but I think thematically it was a really cool affix. I loved Torghast. I didn't hate Torghast in Shadowlands. I really, really enjoyed it. A lot of people really hated Torghast, so I mean, that might be why I think Tormented is a lot higher up than a lot of people think it is. Awakened is, without a doubt, like, the first S-tier Mythic Plus affix in the game. Afflicted was... Awakened. Awakened is a Mythic Plus affix. Awakened was a Mythic Plus affix that kind of killed the rogue meta in BFA, because Awakened put these 4 void obelisks evocative of old gods, since N'Zoth was the theme for Season 4 of BFA. These obelisks would be littered around the instance that you would interact with to go down into the Void Realm, where there would be a mini-boss and some ads waiting for you, and you could kite and kill the mini-bosses anywhere inside the dungeon, and a portal would spawn in that spot. And then as you did more obelisks, all of the portals in the Void Realm were interconnected, allowing you to kind of make your own dungeon in terms of what you chose to pull and when. You even had the option to ignore obelisks entirely, and you would fight the mini-bosses with the final boss at the end of the dungeon. And that was really cool. That was a really cool thing for Blizzard to do, especially because I was a victim of the rogue meta in BFA. I was a victim of the rogue meta in BFA, so seeing an affix introduced to nuke the rogue meta was really, really satisfying. So Awakened, both from a gameplay and thematic standpoint, really good affix. Shrouded. I really liked Shrouded. I think Shrouded was a really good affix. It was the Shadowlands Season 4 affix. It was the Shadowlands Season 4 affix where random mobs would be added to the dungeon, as well as random mobs. would be disguised as dreadlords. At the start of the dungeon, you would pick... a secondary stat, crit, haste, verse, or mastery, and you would be given a certain percentage or mastery in the case of, or amount in the case of mastery, of that stat stacking for each dreadlord in the dungeon you killed, with an additional mini-boss giving you 3 stacks. And it was pretty cool. It let you just, like, turbo power by the end of it if you were so inclined, but it wasn't, like, mega overpowered if because it was like decently balanced. Really good really good affix. Not as good as Awakened, but really good. Now, I'm gonna unfortunately have to be a little objective. I'm not gonna be a personal opinion based for this affix, but I think Encrypted objectively was one of the best affixes as well. Seasonals, because Encrypted gave you 3 things that would spawn on specific trash packs and on every boss that upon one of them dying would despawn the other 2 and spawn a robot mob that upon being killed would grant you 2 set out of 2 groups of 3 benefits. For which was the primary one, it was reduced CDR, I believe. I think it was like 300% reduced CDR. Cooldown reduction is what that means on abilities, which was kind of neat. I played a few specs in Season 3 of Shadowlands that didn't really get to benefit too much from My favorite, personally, was Vi, which was basically like a Bloodlust, but no one ever really... And I think a damage proc, but no one ever really liked Vi, and no one liked Vi because, you know, you had to chase it to fight it. But even still, I mean, Vi wasn't a terrible buff, and then you had WoW, which gave you a turbo speed buff and stealth, as long as you didn't enter combat, which allowed for really weird routing options in some dungeons, and that was actually really cool. I didn't get to enjoy, just like Prideful, I didn't get to enjoy as Cryptid as much as I possibly could have, but Encrypted was a really good affix. In the D tier, we have Infernal. Now, some of you who watch this video might go, what the hell is Infernal? Infernal in Shadowlands, during 10.1.5, Blizzard released Mythic Plus Time Walking for Legion dungeons. I think it was supposed to act as something of a blueprint for how we have Mythic Plus dungeons from older expansions implemented in the game currently. But during Legion Time Walking, you would be able to enter Legion Mythic Plus dungeons, which had their own unique seasonal affix. What it was before nearly every boss, there was this weird pylon that when you interacted with would summon a special demon mini-boss, as well as some minions of that mini-boss, I believe, as well as raining infernals down on the ground. Now, you could do something to, like, get a buff from the infernals, and it was just a big AoE fest. It was also similar to Awakened. If you engaged the boss by a demon pylon, it would auto-activate the demon pylon, and you would have to fight it with the boss. Which, I mean, I don't think the potential of Infernal was really explored because no one wanted to do Legion Mythic Plus, really. A few people did go ahead and do it. A great number of people probably tried it out, but I don't think it really got all that much traction, so Infernal and its potential and its intrigue wasn't really explored all that much, and that's unfortunate for it, because I think it was actually kind of a cool affix. Entangling, B tier. Entangling isn't too horribly oppressive as a brand new affix starting in Season 2 of Dragonflight. If you have anything that can remove snares or slows off of you, then it's kind of trivial. Otherwise, just move a little ways and you're good to go, and a lot of classes don't really get too hindered by that. The last two. My little friends. Afflicted, F tier. The issue with Afflicted is that some classes can't interact with it. And pug groups in LFG only really invite people who can interact with affixes. And for the most part, it's so they don't have to interact with the affixes. So, you know, if you're a Death Knight, a Warrior, or a Warlock, and you're just straight pugging, you're going to have a pretty bad time on Afflicted weeks because you can't do anything to them. Every other class, however, if you have the capacity to do something to an Afflicted that spawns, and you aren't even spec'd into it, you're kind of an asshole. Because you are risking potential problems and potential wipes just because you don't want to take and use a specific talent in your fucking tree for a DPS loss. You know what else is a DPS loss? Letting Afflicted go off. So for those of you watching that maybe, you know, don't know what you can do, take your detox, take your cleanse, take your dispel curse, remove curse, nature's cure. If your class can do it, take the talent, interact with Afflicted. You're gonna piss a lot less people off that way. And you're gonna feel better about yourself when you have more dispels on them at the end of the dungeon. You might not, but I do from time to time. And then the last dungeon, Incorporeal, also F tier. How the hell did they remove like 4 affixes coming into Season 2 of Dragonflight, add 3, and 2 of the 3 they added fucking suck? So, Incorporeal is slightly better in that only one spec has the complete inability to do anything to it. And that is Unholy Death Knight. Incorporeal is susceptible to mind control, but Unholy Death Knight just loses a metric fuck ton of damage and is effectively dead weight as a party member if they dismiss their pet to tame the Incorporeal. Otherwise, everybody else can do something with Incorporeal. The problem is they have a way too short a cast time on their ability for way too much punishment for them lasting 20 whole seconds and spawning almost always in groups of 2. I think Afflicted and Incorporeal are the most punishing, unfair, and oppressive affixes that Blizzard has ever added. And that's why they sit down in the F tier with Thundering, Beguiling, and Explosive. And that is my tier list for Mythic Plus dungeons, or Mythic Plus dungeon affixes of all time. It utilizes every Mythic Plus affix that has ever been in the game. And that's the list. Without further ado, we're going to end the video right here. This has been quite the long tier list. I didn't have a tier list this long since my vanilla Golden Sun tier list video. Leave your thoughts, comments, and concerns in the comments down below, and I will see you next time.